family then looked to Dougal and they asked him if they were going to survive. I mean, as a father, as a leader, how do you look your children and your wife in the eyes and tell them that they're going to die? Folks, this story is so messed up and honestly at times straight up disgusting that I'm going to have to give you a warning before certain parts of it so that those of you with a weak stomach can just kind of skip through it and skip ahead. But with that said, if you can stick it out until the very end of this story, I'm actually going to reveal a couple photos that I think are going to take this already unbelievable tale to a whole new level. So folks, smash that subscribe button harder than a killer whale smashing into a sailboat. You'll understand why I said that very shortly. And if you subscribe, you're also going to get to feel all warm and fuzzy inside because you're helping us reach our very ambitious goal of hitting 1 million subscribers before the end of the year. And so with that said, I have a question for those of you who are parents. If your 9-year-old came up to you and asked for you to take them and the rest of your family on a DIY sailing trip around the globe, what would you tell them? Now, I'm not a father yet, but I am afraid of the ocean, and so I can tell you without a doubt that if my child came up to me and asked that, I would say, no, we're not doing that. We're not going to sail around the world. That's a crazy idea. And honestly, I'd be willing to bet that most of you would probably tell your child the same thing. However, in the late 1960s, a father from England was asked that very question by his 9-year-old son, and when this father was asked, he said, yes. This father's name was Dougal Robertson, and to be fair to Dougal, he actually had a pretty good reason for saying yes. You see, Dougal had served in the British Merchant Navy, where he had been a sea captain and a master mariner. But by the time his child asked him this question, that was years ago, and at this point, Dougal had traded in the high seas for what he felt was a very boring life as a dairy farmer in a small English town. He wasn't happy with where he was. And so he may not have realized this, but by the year 1968, Dougal was subconsciously looking for a way to kind of just take his family and just start over. I'm sure some of you have been there before. And it's kind of hard to know exactly what to do when you're in this kind of predicament, but for Dougal, the answer kind of just fell right into his lap one day. In the late 1960s, the Robertson family had been following the voyage of Robin Knox Johnston, who would become the first person to sail around the world solo, by himself. Totally insane. And so one day, Dougal's 9-year-old son, Neil, asked the innocent question, quote, "Daddy's a sailor. Why don't we sail around the world too?" And again, I think if most of us were in this situation, we would kind of just brush it off. But when Neil asked Dougal this question, it ignited a firestorm within him. Oh, and by the way, it also ignited great fear into his wife, Lynn. While Dougal and his children were instantly hooked on this idea of living at sea, navigating around the globe, whatever, Lynn was not convinced. And as if that wasn't bad enough, Lynn knew that there was pretty much nothing she could do to stop her husband because, well, her stubborn and allegedly even abusive at times husband, Dougal, well, he was going to get his way no matter what. Dougal's oldest son, who is named Douglas, was quoted saying, "Dad was a bit of a tyrant, and we lived under his command." This Dougal guy apparently had a pretty mighty temper, and allegedly he wasn't always afraid to use violence to get what he wanted, especially not even with Lynn, but with Douglas, the son I just quoted from there. Dougal would routinely hit his son Douglas, and this left Douglas with no choice but to try to kind of just contain his father's rage as much as he possibly could, which is a terrible situation to be in when you're, a teenager trying to grow up like this. But at the same time, the young Douglas still admired his father. They butted heads, yes. They even exchanged punches on a fairly regular basis, apparently, but the father and son shared the same adventurous spirit. And so due to this, when Dougal announced that the family would be selling their farm to go sail around the world, Douglas, who was in his teens, well, he was all in. By the year 1971, the family had rid themselves of their failing farm, and they moved into a 43-foot or 13-meter wooden sailboat named the Lucette. Literally the only preparation that they had for this new life at sea was to have their appendixes removed before they left. I mean, can you imagine this? Just like that, the naive family now found themselves sailing across the ocean with nothing in sight except for the occasional jumping fish, of course, and miles and miles and miles of salty water. Oh, and speaking of salt, by the way, did you know that if you don't replace your salt and electrolytes when you're sweating, you could end up with muscle cramps, fatigue, and much more? That's right, what a convenient way to tell you about our sponsor, Drink Element. Drink Element is the best electrolyte drink mix in the game. It tastes amazing, first of all. They have amazing flavors like citrus salt, grapefruit salt. Those are my two favorites, but they got raspberry. And they have these more creative flavors too, like mango chili or chocolate salt. You can like add it to some hot chocolate or something. I don't know, you can get creative with their flavors. It's really cool. And while they all taste so good, they don't have any sugar in them, which might not sound like that much to some of you, but this is actually a really big deal. I mean, the only reason any of their competitors even taste half decent, which most of them don't honestly, but the ones that do, it's because they're loaded with sugar. But Element manages to have an amazing, unique taste, to have all the electrolytes that you need to stay hydrated and safe when you're sweating. And they manage to do all that without having any sugar in it, which is awesome. So folks, what you should do right now is click the link at the top of the description or go to drinkelement.com/KyleHatesHiking. That's drinkelement.com/KyleHatesHiking. Go through my link and make a purchase of whatever sounds best from Element's website. You could try their sparkling, which is like a sparkling water version of their electrolytes, which also tastes amazing. Just go make a purchase, and then when you do it through my link, you're gonna get a sample pack of 8 additional Element flavors thrown in with your order for no extra cost. It's essentially free Element. And so you got to try it one more time. drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking or click that link right at the top of the description. And now let's get back to the story. It would end up taking the Robertsons 33 days to cross the Atlantic Ocean, which just so happens to be the same amount of days that it took Christopher Columbus. But regardless, that's still a pretty good feat, right? 33 days for this inexperienced family to sail across the ocean. And by this point, they were kind of starting to settle into their life at sea. And this was ramped up even more once they reached the Bahamas, which I hear is amazing. And one day, while they were sailing on the outskirts of Nassau, they came across a fisherman whose engine had broken down. And so without any hesitation, Dougal, who was, the leader of the family, obviously, Dougal decided that they were going to tow this fisherman's broken boat back into Nassau. And they did it successfully. And that sounds cool and all to us who don't really know anything about sailing, but this was actually a massive deal at the time. It made local headlines, and the public in the Bahamas just found it extraordinary that this measly little sailboat had managed to tow another boat all the way back into safety. This is something that doesn't happen apparently, or at least, I don't know. It was crazy. And a local dive shop owner in Nassau was so impressed with the family's actions that he actually invited them to pick out anything from his store to take home for free. But little did he know, well, the Robertsons' daughter Anne would end up picking out the store owner's son, not an item from the store. She chose the son, and basically had fallen head over heels in love with this young man. And at this point, she informed her family that she was going to be leaving the voyage behind so that she could go marry him. Anne wouldn't have known it at the time, but this decision to ditch her family's voyage would kind of accidentally end up being the best decision that she had ever made up to that point in her life, and you're going to understand why very soon. The family spent 6 months in Miami so that they could save up enough money to continue sailing around the globe, and a little bit of a warning here. It was during this time in Miami that a local male nurse began to make some advances, we'll say, on the underage Douglas. Now, the details of this aren't really known. I don't even know if I want to know, to be honest. And Douglas would end up kind of confiding this to his dad, but Dougal responded by basically dismissing his son's emotions. I don't know if he didn't believe him or if he just didn't think it was that big a deal, but regardless, Douglas had gone to his father for support and also for protection, and he had received neither of those in response. And so at the beginning of 1972, about a year into their voyage at this point, the family started sailing south, hoping to reach and travel through the Panama Canal. Just before they entered the canal, they stopped in a nearby town to kind of resupply and rest a little bit, and it's there that they met a man named Robin Williams, who had just left his job as a professor in the Boston area in order to hitchhike around the world. Okay, that's a bad joke, obviously, but there's actually just a little bit of truth in it. The family obviously didn't meet the Robin Williams, the famous actor from Good Will Hunting and other Hollywood movies, and the comedian, we all know him. They didn't meet that Robin Williams, but they did meet a different man who had the same name, which is why I had to make that joke. Now, this 22-year-old Robin Williams was actually from the UK, just like the Robertsons, and he was, in fact, hitchhiking around the world. Dougal allowed this young man to join their voyage for free in exchange for him tutoring the young children that the family had in English and math while they were out at sea. Apparently, Dougal felt a little guilty about pulling the kids out of school, but I digress. So after Robin Williams joined the crew, the family sailed through the Panama Canal, and at this point, well, they had finally entered the mighty Pacific Ocean. They sailed on for 10 more days, hoping to reach the Galapagos Islands. But while they were in the middle of this leg of their journey, a very significant event took place, though the family didn't realize how significant it was at the time. A giant 50-foot killer whale mistook the Robertsons' boat for another whale and basically decided it was time to get freaky, if you know what I mean. Basically, the whale tried to screw the boat, thinking it was another whale. It rubbed itself against the bottom of the Lucette before probably very quickly realizing that it had made a very embarrassing mistake and then swimming away. Now, when this happened, the Robertsons thought it was kind of humorous, if not mildly annoying, and, they thought it would make a good story one day, but that's pretty much all they thought about it. They didn't really realize that, well, this event should have served as a giant warning sign. Because this one whale mistook the Robertsons' boat for another whale, the chances that another, maybe less horny and less friendly whale might do the same in the future, well, those chances were obviously very high. The Robertsons left the Galapagos Islands on June 13th, 1972, blissfully unaware of the danger that they were sailing directly into. Now, their next destination was the Marquesas Islands, which were some 3,000 miles away, but the Robertsons would never make it that far. In fact, they wouldn't even come close. On the morning of June 15th, only 2 days into their new leg of the journey, the family had just started to enjoy a fresh pot of coffee in the morning when all of a sudden they heard this massive bang on the bottom of their boat. The boat was kind of like lifted out of the water a little bit, and then they heard another bang and then another bang. Douglas then watched 3 killer whales, one with its head split open, spewing blood, swim behind the Robertsons' boat. Douglas then peered down into the hatch and he saw his father standing in water that had risen up to his waist. And in that very moment, Dougal screamed what are probably the 2 most dreaded words that any sailor could possibly hear, which were abandon ship. This all happened so fast, right? So Douglas's brain immediately did, its best to kind of shield him from the nightmare that was unfolding right before his eyes. He started to convince himself that he was actually dreaming. I mean, surely none of this could be real, right? We can't actually be sinking. We can't actually be abandoning our ship. So a few more moments go by, and then Dougal screamed at Douglas again, this time telling him to get out the family's life raft, which was, again, a task that Douglas was not prepared mentally to do. And so instead, as the boat began to sink further and further into the ocean, Douglas started to take down the sails and just kind of do some busy work like that, assuming that he would wake up from this nightmare at any moment, right? And all would be well. But then, having been forced out of the lower part of the boat, essentially, because it was full of water, Dougal appeared, and once again, he screamed at Douglas, telling him to get that damn life raft over the side of the boat and into the water, because we need to get off this ship. We're sinking. Something about this last command just caused Douglas to finally regain his clarity, and in that moment, he realized that his life was about to change forever, if he even kept it at all. The Robertsons actually had 2 small emergency vessels on board the Lucette. They had that inflatable life raft that Dougal was screaming about, and then they also had this small dinghy, which is a very fun word to say. I'm going to be saying it a lot, so lucky me. But Douglas immediately launched both of these vessels into the water, and then, literally without a second to spare, he was knocked off the deck by a wave, and he was thrown into the depths of the ocean, right around these killer whales, these pissed off killer whales. And when he was knocked into the water, Douglas immediately began swimming towards the life raft, of course, which was being pushed away slowly by the wind. And if he hadn't swam fast enough, then it honestly might have blown away for good. But as scary as that sounds, that actually wasn't even what Douglas was thinking about while he was swimming. His mind was occupied by something else, which was, again, those killer freaking whales. Now, if you're afraid of the ocean like me, this is literally your worst nightmare, obviously. While Douglas was swimming towards the life raft, he thought for sure that he was about to be eaten by these whales, the very same killer whales that had just attacked their boat in the first place. He thought they were going to eat the rest of his family too. Douglas had heard that if a whale bites your legs, you won't even feel the bite. And so as he's swimming, he's like continuously reaching down, touching his legs just to make sure that they're still there. I mean, can you imagine this? Like, try to put yourself in that place for a second. I can barely even do it. It's so scary. But by some miracle, Douglas was able to make it onto the life raft. And at this point, he joined the rest of his family and Robin Williams. He was literally the last one to make it back to the life raft. And so as they're all just crammed in there now, watching the last of their beloved Lucette sink below the waterline, the young Robertson twins began to cry. Lynn tried to reassure them. She tried to tell them that they were going to be safe, it was going to be okay, but the twins told her that the reason they were crying wasn't because they were scared, but they were crying, but rather because they knew that they were never going to see the Lucette ever again. This boat that had been their home for the last 2 years, it was gone. That chapter was over. And in all the chaos and all the danger that had just occurred, that was the thing that got to the twins the most. But then again, I kind of doubt that these young children really understood exactly how dangerous of a situation it was, because if they did, they probably would have been crying for, that reason, crying for the fact that the family was on the verge of death. I mean, they were kind of just sitting there on the raft, trying to face the gravity of the situation that they were in. And of course, the first step for Lynn anyways was to try and get everybody to say the Lord's Prayer. Now, everyone in the raft was down for this, except for, of course, Dougal. In his continued stubbornness, Dougal, who did not believe in God, refused to say the Lord's Prayer, even in what was surely the most dangerous moment of his entire life, even while his family's lives were all on the line. Now, Douglas, who was also an atheist just like his father, even tried to reason with Dougal, telling him that they were likely going to be needing God's help very soon. Maybe we should just say the prayer, but Dougal still refused, saying God would know if I was faking it anyway, so why should I even do it? It's just a perfect illustration of this bizarre family dynamic under Dougal's leadership. And so after this whole prayer debate was finished, the family then looked to Dougal and they asked him a very simple question, a question that no father wants to be asked ever, by the way. They asked him if they were going to survive, if they were going to make it. And as much as Dougal didn't want to be asked this question, he was even more desperate to avoid giving the true answer to it. I mean, as a father, as a leader, how do you look your children and your wife in the eyes and tell them that they're going to die? How do you do that? I mean, I can't even imagine. And what Dougal decided to do was to basically give this long-winded answer that would kind of eventually wrap back around and reveal the family's inevitable fate. And so he began by bluntly kind of laying out the situation that the family was in. You know, something along the lines of, the Lucette had sank in a matter of minutes. This left them little time to grab supplies before they were thrown overboard. They had managed to grab enough food rations to last about 10 days. You know, they had water that would last about the same amount of time. Nobody knew that they were out there. Nobody would be coming to rescue them. They were downwind from the Galapagos Islands, and so there was no way that they could paddle back to them. You know, Dougal is kind of just laying all of this stuff out for the family, and he's ready to finally deliver the news that they were screwed, that they were going to die, when all of a sudden, Douglas interrupted him. Douglas blurted out that the family needed to paddle towards the doldrums if they were going to survive. Now, the doldrums are an area that is essentially a belt around the equator, and this area is known for having a lot of thunderstorms and rain. And so Douglas, recognizing that the family's most pressing need was water, thought that if they could reach the doldrums, they might have at least a fighting chance of survival. So he interrupts his father, he blurts this out, and instead of scolding or even hitting his son for interrupting him, as Dougal probably normally would have done, Dougal began to kind of just sit back and think about the idea that Douglas had just proposed. The father and son pair started kind of going back and forth with each other about how they could survive, assessing the resources they had, figuring out what they needed to do, and eventually they came up with a plan. First, they were going to sail to the doldrums, and then once they had enough water, they would continue on until they finally hit the North American coast. And so what had started as Dougal trying to tell his family that they were going to die had transformed into him telling them that they actually had a chance to make it. They had this plan. And of course that brought some hope, but the reality was it didn't really bring that much of it. I mean, I don't want to paint the wrong picture here. They were definitely still in a very, very bad situation. And speaking of that, I really need to give you the first of many warnings throughout the rest of this story. If the concept of cannibalism makes you squeamish, then you might want to skip this next part. So the family had their plan, but they were still desperate enough that they literally discussed cannibalism amongst each other. Can you imagine having to have this conversation with your parents or your children? They have this conversation and they ultimately promised each other that if they started to pass away, the living members would not eat them. They promised that they were not going to eat each other, which might sound obvious to you while you're sitting at home, but the harsh truth is that there are a lot of examples throughout history of stranded castaways eating each other at sea out of desperation. There's literally a whole thing where sometimes they would deliberately kill one of the party members just to eat them. That was not going to happen with the Robertsons, however. They make this promise that no matter what, no matter who dies, doesn't matter, we're not going to eat each other. However, Robin Williams was kind of the odd one out here. I mean, imagine being in his position. He's the only person on the boat that isn't part of this family, who's not related to them by blood. And so On that first day, Robin was legitimately worried that the family might eat him. Thankfully, and also much to his relief, the Robertsons assured him that for the duration of the disaster, Robin himself was going to be a member of their family. Now, this is obviously a very awkward conversation, to put it mildly, but everyone came away from it with the assurance, basically, that, not only were they not going to eat each other, but that they were going to work together. They were going to pool their resources, they were going to team up, and they were going to fight for their survival. They had this loose plan, but at the same time, the family was really hoping that somewhere along their route towards the doldrums, they were going to be intercepted by another vessel who would then rescue them and save their lives. Of course, they were going to do everything they could to reach the coast, but they also knew their chances of doing that were very, very slim. I mean, even if they did somehow replenish their food and water supplies, the chances of them making it was extremely small. I mean, there's 6 people that were stuck between this tiny dinghy that had a jerry-rigged sail and then this other life raft, which was constantly deflating and taking on water pretty much from the moment it was launched. And so they know that they need to get rescued. They sail for nearly a week. They kind of just scrape by. And then on day 6, for a very brief moment, the family thought that their nightmare was about to end with the best conclusion possible. They're sailing along, and then all of a sudden, they spot this ship a few miles off in the distance, which isn't really that far of a distance, when you're on the flat water like that. And so the family immediately dipped into their limited supply of flares to try and catch the attention of the ship's captain. They set off 5 flares, one after the other, and yet the ship sailed right on by them. The family watched as it dipped below the horizon, and just like that, their best chance, possibly their only chance at rescue, was gone. Now, this could have been the event that kind of broke the family. This could have made them just give up and lose all hope, or try to end their lives even. But in a weird, inspirational way, this defeating, crushing moment actually seemed to reignite the family's will to survive. As they watched this ship sail out of sight, the family realized that they could no longer hope to actually get rescued. It wasn't even in the cards for them anymore. They had to survive until they got themselves out of this situation, until they got themselves to safety. That was the only option. And so they put rescue out of their mind, and they got busy catching turtles. I mean, you heard that right. Turtles. Turtles and fish would be the main sources of sustenance for the Robertsons. And it's at this point that I need to give another warning here, because things are about to get a little graphic. And so if you really like turtles and animals, I would probably skip this next part. Okay, so Douglas was the one that actually caught the very first turtle, and he kind of hit it over the head with a paddle, trying to kill it. The turtle's eyes then filled up with blood, but unfortunately it didn't die. The turtle was gravely injured, but it was able to kind of escape and swim off. And this, of course, caused Douglas to reassess his tactics. He's like, this turtle's gonna die anyway, so the fact that it still swam off and we wouldn't be able to eat it and use it as a resource, well, that was a great tragedy, of course. And so the Robertsons knew that they had to get smarter if they were going to catch these turtles for real. They managed to catch another one shortly after this, but that one too got away. But folks, they say the third time's the charm, and that's true. So when the third turtle came along, Douglas and Dougal, they managed to get it into the dinghy, and at this time, they slit its throat. And as they began to take stock, we'll say, of this dead turtle, they realized that they had just accidentally stumbled upon basically a miracle for them in their situation. They realized that they could sustain the entire family on these turtles. I mean, not only was the meat good to eat, but the female turtles often had eggs that almost resembled grapes, grapes of the sea, you could say. And in addition to the food that the turtles supplied, they also supplied something that could work to quench the family's thirst. And that brings me to yet another warning, because this part is pretty nasty, I'm not gonna lie. So you good? You good? Okay. You sure? Okay. So the family realized that they could drink the blood of the turtles that they captured. And so after killing each turtle, Dougal would kind of pump the turtle blood into a jar, and then they would pass the jar around, kind of like they were passing around a joint, until the jar was finished. Apparently the last person to get the jar would have to like stir the blood around to kind of loosen it up, because it would kind of like harden as time went on. This is what it takes to survive, folks. I mean, just brutal. So the dinghy, and especially this inflatable life raft, were constantly taking on water, which meant that the family was always sitting and even trying to sleep in salt water, essentially. And this predictably began to wreak havoc on their bodies. They started to break out in these boils and sores. The family's clothing began to erode day after day, which of course left their skin exposed to these brutal sunburns. And so after 2 weeks, everyone was naked, essentially. I mean, it was more comfortable on their skin with all these boils and stuff to just not wear clothing anyways. And by the way, this is also around the time that the life raft finally gave in. This raft had been slowly disintegrating basically from day one. It was in constant need of bailing and to be reinflated. And so by day 17, the family decided to just ditch it. This meant that now all 6 of them were crammed into this tiny dinghy, and space was so limited that everyone kind of just stayed in their assigned spot, and there was no room to even stand up or move around. I mean, they were sleeping on top of each other. They were trying to go to the bathroom in this situation. I mean, can you imagine you're trying to go to the bathroom and your mom is like 2 feet away from you, cramped on this dinghy with you? Oh, and also this dinghy was way less stable than the inflatable life raft. And so if one big wave came along, or if somebody stepped in the wrong spot at the wrong time, they were going to capsize. Their situation is just going from bad to worse. And by this point, they had reached the doldrums, which was good news to a degree because they were able to replenish their water supply. But, in order to get that water, that rain, that meant they had to make it through these massive, massive thunderstorms. The only thing that scares me more than the ocean is lightning. And so I've probably said this like 3 times, but this is literally my worst nightmare. Being trapped in the ocean in this tiny boat with lightning crashing all around you, with waves crashing into the boat. I mean, dude, this obviously sucked big time, but the family also found it difficult to complain about this, because if it wasn't for the rain that these violent thunderstorms brought, then they probably would have already died. And this brings me to the biggest warning that I've given so far in this video. If you thought the turtle blood thing was bad, then wait till you hear this. And especially skip this part if you're eating right now, which you probably tapped out already if that was the case, because this is a nasty one. But anyways, so after getting all this rain, and of course from all the salt water kind of spilling over the sides of the boat, the bottom of this dinghy was disgusting. It was filled with, just excess water, turtle blood. Of course, they're like sitting, and their gross bodies and feet are kind of mixing up with the water at the bottom of the boat. I'm telling you, the bottom of the boat was just a mixture of nastiness that would instantly poison you if you tried to drink it. However, Lynn didn't want this water to go to waste. Again, they've gotten some rainwater, but they still need more, right? And so Lynn had actually worked as a nurse before the Robertsons began their voyage, and due to her experience, she knew that this nasty water at the bottom of the boat could be used to hydrate the family without poisoning them if it was taken rectally. You heard that right. Lynn created this makeshift enema tube from a ladder rung that the family had, and she started to administer this nasty water to everyone in the enemas, except for Robin, who apparently politely declined. So yeah, that's absolutely disgusting. And it's yet another example of how desperate the family was to survive. In a weird way, you have to kind of respect it, right? But while they weren't administering dirty enemas or drinking turtle blood, the family actually had quite a bit of downtime while they were just sailing along. And this downtime was incredibly difficult for them because those were the moments when their minds would just start to wander to, the worst places imaginable. And thus, they started to come up with some creative ways to pass the time, to keep their minds from wandering like this. Robin Williams was known not only for declining the enemas, but also for being a talker. And while in normal life, this might have been kind of annoying, the classic person who just won't shut up, right? It actually proved to be a huge asset for the family while they were crammed together on the dinghy. Robin could just talk for hours. He could just go and go. He would have been the perfect candidate to start a podcast if those existed in the 70s. And so Robin's nonstop chatter and talking and stories, this provided some crucial entertainment for the Robertsons while they were just floating along. Now that we're done talking about enemas and turtle blood, let's talk about food. So this was something that was always on everyone's mind because, believe it or not, raw turtle meat gets pretty old after a while. And so they actually created this fictitious restaurant called Dougal's Cafe. And I'm telling you, they would talk for hours about what kind of food this cafe would serve and how they would prepare it, what the menu would be like. They just went super, super deep into this. And they also started playing the game I Spy, though this proved pretty challenging because everything outside of the dinghy, the sea, the sun, the sky, well, all of those things started with the letter S. The family floated through the Pacific Ocean for 17 days before they finally lost that life raft. And then they spent an additional 20 days crammed inside of this tiny dinghy. But then, on day 38 since the original sinking of the Lucette, the family was in the middle of a conversation about the Dougal Cafe that they had made up, when all of a sudden, Dougal himself casually kind of looked over his shoulder and announced, "Oh, hey, look, there's a ship over there." He said those words and then he turned back and returned to the conversation about the cafe as if nothing had happened. Astonishingly, it took a few more moments before Dougal's eyes kind of lit up, realizing that they had just been presented with another opportunity to potentially be rescued. There was literally a ship a mile off in the distance. The family had become so obsessed with this idea of self-rescue, not relying on anybody else, that they had almost forgotten that there was actually still a chance that they might run into another ship. And so when Dougal first noticed the ship off in the distance, he didn't even think twice about it. He didn't even put it together that they might actually be able to get rescued by this one. But of course, eventually, after a few seconds, he did kind of come to, and he stood up and immediately began setting off what remained of the family's flares. Dougal burnt through the first flare, and then he tried to shoot off the second one, which didn't work. And then he lit the third and final flare and held it up. He held onto this flare for so long that it actually began to kind of burn his hand when it got to the bottom. And then he tossed it up into the air and out of the dinghy. From a mile away, the captain of the Japanese Toka Maru 2 saw the arc of this discarded flare, and at first he speculated that this small vessel might be occupied by pirates. However, this didn't last very long. He quickly realized that they were actually castaways, and so within 10 minutes, the fishing boat pulled up alongside the Robertsons and tossed them this dirty, smelly rope. That marked the moment where they officially realized that they were saved. At this point, they're so dehydrated that they hadn't peed for, over a week. Their bodies were so destroyed that if they had been thrown overboard at this point, they probably wouldn't have had the strength to even climb back into the dinghy. And so surrounded by sharks. Each one of the Robertsons, plus Robin himself, carefully climbed out of the dinghy and onto the Tokamaru 2, marking the very moment after 38 days at sea that the family nightmare was finally over. The fact that nobody died during those 38 days is both a miracle and also a testament to the strength and resilience of the Robertsons and Robin Williams. And yet, while the family did somehow survive the ordeal, Dougal and Lynn's marriage unfortunately did not. They would end up getting divorced just a year later, though Lynn did apparently come back to care for Dougal in his final days before his 1991 death. Both Dougal and Lynn were apparently never able to forgive themselves for what the family had gone through. And I imagine, this is just speculation, but Dougal himself, because it was kind of his idea and he was the leader, well, I imagine that he probably felt the worst out of the two. Dougal and Douglas's relationship after this ordeal is just as complicated as Dougal and Lynn's marriage, frankly. And so Douglas obviously still resented his father for his tough and sometimes violent upbringing, but he also admired his father greatly, and he even credited him with leading the family through those 38 harrowing days at sea, which is something that's kind of difficult to wrap your head around, right? Because if it wasn't for Dougal, the family probably wouldn't have ended up in that horrible situation in the first place. But yet, at the same time, if it wasn't for Dougal, they also probably wouldn't have survived. Now, I want to show you guys a couple photos that absolutely blow my mind. So when I was researching for this story, I didn't truly understand how cramped it was inside of the dinghy until I saw this photo right here. As you can see, there's literally no room for them to move around. And again, they would have been eating, going to the bathroom, killing turtles, and trying to sleep while confined in this tiny space for 21 days. Now, obviously, this photo was taken after the disaster, when all the press started writing about it, of course. But I don't know, despite the fact that they're smiling, despite the fact that they look, well-dressed and healthy in this photo, just the fact that they're crammed in there like that, I just think it's so incredibly disturbing. Both Dougal and Douglas would go on to publish books detailing their experience. And so if you want even more details about this story, then I've linked both of their books in the description of this video. Folks, you guys are the best. I have the best subscribers on YouTube. I appreciate all of you so much, and I'm going to see you next week. Oh, and by the way, YouTube seems to think that you'll enjoy watching this video next, and so give it a click. And once again, just thank you for being the best audience on YouTube.